Laura Bennett had always believed that she was one of the lucky ones. She had a beautiful home in the hills of Connecticut, a daughter who made her proud every single day, and a husband who seemed to love her deeply. Daniel Bennett was not just any man. He was the CEO of Pinnacle Holdings, one of the fastest-growing investment firms on the East Coast. He wore expensive suits, drove a black Mercedes, and had a smile that could light up any room he walked into. Laura had married him 11 years ago, and for most of those years, she had felt safe, loved, and truly happy. She was not a woman who sat at home doing nothing. Laura ran a small interior design business from the lower floor of their home. She had built it herself, client by client, year by year. She was proud of that. She did not depend on Daniel's money, even though she could have. She had her own income, her own clients, and her own sense of purpose. But no matter how independent she was, she always came back to the same truth. Daniel was the center of her world. Their daughter, Mia, was 9 years old. She was bright, funny, and deeply attached to both her parents. Every Sunday, the three of them would have breakfast together, and Daniel would read Mia the comics from the newspaper, even though Mia always rolled her eyes and told him no one read newspapers anymore. It was a small tradition, but Laura held it close to her heart. It was proof, she thought, that their family was real and solid. The first sign that something was wrong came in February. Daniel started working late. Not occasionally, almost every night. He told her it was a major merger deal that required his full attention. Laura understood. She had always understood. She never pressured him, never questioned him too deeply. She trusted him completely. When he came home at midnight smelling of cologne and exhaustion, she would leave a plate of food in the microwave and go back to sleep without saying a word. But then came a Sunday in March when Mia ran to her father as he walked through the door, and Daniel flinched. Just slightly. It was so small that most people would have missed it. But Laura saw it. She saw how his eyes darted to his jacket pocket just for a second before he scooped Mia up and kissed her on the cheek. She told herself it meant nothing. She convinced herself she was being paranoid. A week later, his phone buzzed on the kitchen counter while he was in the shower. Laura was not the kind of woman who checked her husband's phone. She never had been. But the name on the screen stopped her cold. It did not say a work contact or a colleague's name. It said home. Laura stared at that word for a long moment. She did not touch the phone. She walked back to the kitchen table, sat down with her coffee, and stared out the window at the snow still sitting on the front lawn. Her hands were completely steady, but inside, something had already begun to crack. She did not say anything that night, or the night after. Instead, she started paying attention in a way she never had before. She noticed that Daniel always took his phone to the bathroom. She noticed that he had started buying 2 of certain things, 2 phone chargers, 2 sets of headphones, 2 gym bags at different times. She noticed that his credit card statements, which used to come to the house, had suddenly switched to paperless billing. She noticed all of it quietly, without letting him see that she noticed. Laura was not a dramatic woman. She did not want to scream or cry or throw things. She wanted to know the truth. So she started looking for it in a calm and careful way. She began by calling a private investigator named Frank Reyes, who came highly recommended by a friend who had once used him during a business dispute. She told Frank only what she needed to. She gave him Daniel's office address, his car plates, and his usual schedule. Then she waited. Frank came back to her in 10 days. He asked her to meet him at a coffee shop in the next town over, away from anyone who might know her face. Laura drove there alone on a Thursday afternoon, ordered a black coffee she never drank, and sat across from a man who placed a brown envelope on the table between them without a word. Inside that envelope were photographs. Clear, sharp, dated photographs. There was a house, a nice house, not as large as hers but well-kept and warm-looking, with a red front door and flower boxes under the windows. There were photographs of Daniel walking through that red door. There were photographs of Daniel playing with a young boy in the front yard, a boy who looked no older than 5, with the same dark hair and the same jaw as Daniel. There was a photograph of Daniel standing in a kitchen with a woman, a tall woman with short brown hair, and he was handing her a mug of something hot and laughing. Laura sat in that coffee shop for 40 minutes after Frank left. She did not cry. She looked at each photograph slowly, carefully, as if she were studying them for a test. The boy's name, Frank had told her, was Noah. The woman's name was Claire Dawson. She was 34 years old. She had met Daniel 6 years ago at a company event. The house had been purchased in a shell company name 4 years ago. Daniel had been paying all of Claire's bills, Noah's school fees, and the household expenses from a private account that Laura had never known existed. 6 years. For 6 years, her husband had been living 2 lives. For 6 years, while she had been building her business, raising their daughter, making Sunday breakfasts, and trusting him completely, he had been walking into another home through a red front door and drinking hot coffee with another woman. She drove home in complete silence. She parked the car in the driveway, sat there for a moment, and looked at her own house. The lights were on inside. She could see the warm glow through the living room curtains. She could see Mia's bedroom light upstairs. Everything looked the same as it always had. But nothing was the same. Nothing would ever be the same again. That night, she made dinner like normal. She set the table like normal. When Daniel came home, she smiled at him, asked about his day, and passed him the bread basket. He talked about a meeting, about traffic, about how tired he was. She listened to every word. She watched his mouth move, and she thought about that red door and that laughing little boy with Daniel's dark hair. And she kept her face perfectly calm. After dinner, after Mia was in bed, Laura went to her home office and closed the door softly behind her. She sat at her desk and opened her laptop. She did not search for divorce lawyers. She did not draft an angry email. She did not call her sister or her closest friend to pour her heart out. Instead, she opened a blank document and began to write. She listed everything she knew, every account she had access to, every asset she was aware of, every piece of property, every investment, every shared holding she had ever signed her name to. She wrote it all down in neat, precise lines. Then she opened a second tab and began to research. By midnight, she had 3 names, 3 of the best family law attorneys in the state of Connecticut. By 1 in the morning, she had sent each of them a short, professional email requesting an urgent consultation. By 2 in the morning, she had also forwarded copies of Frank's photographs and his full written report to a secure cloud folder that only she had access to. She turned off the lamp, walked upstairs, and slid into bed beside Daniel. He was already asleep. She lay on her side, staring at the ceiling, and made herself a single quiet promise. She was not going to fall apart. She was not going to beg. She was not going to give him the satisfaction of watching her break. Whatever came next, she was going to be ready for it. The first attorney Laura met was a woman named Patricia Holt. Her office was on the 14th floor of a glass building in Hartford, and she had the kind of quiet confidence that comes from winning cases for 20 years. Laura sat across from her on a Friday morning, dressed in a navy blazer and flat shoes, her folder of documents placed neatly on the desk between them. She had not told anyone where she was going. She had told Daniel she had a client meeting. She had told her assistant she would be out until noon. No one knew the truth except her. Patricia looked through the photographs, the investigator's report, and the list of assets Laura had prepared. She read slowly and said nothing for several minutes. Then she looked up and said, "You have been very thorough." Laura said, "I try to be." Patricia nodded and said, "Good. That will help us." That single sentence was the closest thing to comfort Laura had felt in 2 weeks, and she held on to it like something solid. What followed were 3 weeks of preparation that no one in Laura's life could see. On the outside, she continued to function like a woman with a stable and happy marriage. She took Mia to school every morning. She met with her design clients. She cooked dinner, folded laundry, attended a school event where Daniel stood beside her looking proud and handsome and completely at ease. She smiled when she needed to smile. She laughed when the moment called for it. She was so convincing that even her closest friend, a woman named Sarah who had known her for 15 years, had no idea that anything was wrong. But inside that calm surface, Laura was moving quickly. Patricia had advised her on exactly which financial documents she needed to gather copies of before filing anything. Laura worked through them one by one. Joint bank accounts, shared investment portfolios, the mortgage on the Connecticut house, a vacation property in Vermont they had bought 3 years ago, a stock account that had been opened in both their names before Mia was born. She photographed documents, saved digital copies, and organized everything into labeled folders with a focus that surprised even herself. She was not doing this out of anger. She was doing it because she understood, clearly and without emotion, that she was about to fight the most important battle of her life, and she intended to win it. The hardest part was not the legal preparation. The hardest part was Mia. Every time Laura looked at her daughter, sitting at the kitchen table doing homework or brushing her teeth before bed, or reaching up to hold her father's hand in a parking lot, she felt a sharp pain in the center of her chest that she could not fully explain. Mia did not know anything. Mia believed that her family was whole, and Laura knew that very soon, that belief was going to be taken away from her, and there was nothing she could do to soften that completely. She thought about it deeply during those 3 weeks. She thought about whether staying silent was a kindness, or whether it was simply delaying an inevitable pain. She thought about what kind of mother she wanted to be, and what kind of woman she wanted to show her daughter it was possible to become. She kept coming back to the same answer. She could not stay, not because she was weak, but because she was not willing to teach Mia that a woman's love was something a man could take for granted and misuse without consequence. It was on a Tuesday night, in the 4th week, that everything shifted. Daniel came home earlier than usual. Laura was in the kitchen when he walked in, and she noticed immediately that he looked different. His shoulders were tight. His jaw was set in a way she recognized from the early years of their marriage, when he had been under pressure at work. He poured himself a glass of water, drank it standing at the counter, and said nothing. Later that night, after Mia was asleep, Laura was sitting in the living room reading when Daniel came and sat across from her. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I need to tell you something." Laura put her book down. She kept her hands loose in her lap and her face open and calm. She said, "All right." And she waited. What came out of Daniel's mouth in the next 20 minutes was a confession that she had already known in full detail for nearly a month. He told her about Claire. He told her about Noah. He stumbled over the words and he rubbed his face with both hands, and he said at one point that he was sorry, that he had never meant for any of this to happen, that it had grown into something he did not know how to stop. He said he loved her. He said he had always loved her. He said the word complicated 4 times. Laura listened to all of it without interruption. When he finished, the room was very quiet. He was looking at her with red eyes, waiting for her to break down or shout or throw something. She did neither. She sat very still, and she looked at him, and she said calmly, "How old is Noah?" Daniel blinked. He had not expected that question. He said, "He just turned 5. Laura nodded slowly. She said, "So this has been going on since before Mia started school." Daniel said nothing. Laura stood up, picked up her book, and said, "I think we both need some sleep. We can talk more tomorrow." She walked upstairs and left him sitting alone in the living room. The next morning, she called Patricia and told her to file the papers. Patricia asked if she was certain. Laura said yes without any hesitation. Within 48 hours, Daniel Bennett was served with divorce papers at his office. His assistant later told someone, who eventually told Sarah, who called Laura immediately, that Daniel had sat at his desk for a very long time without moving after reading the papers. Laura, when Sarah told her this, simply said, "He'll be all right." What happened next was not what anyone who knew Daniel expected. He called Laura that evening and asked if they could meet privately, without attorneys. She agreed. They sat at the kitchen table while Mia was at a neighbor's house. Daniel told her he did not want a drawn-out legal battle. He told her he was willing to be fair. Laura looked at him and said, "I am not asking you to be fair, Daniel. My attorney is asking for what I am legally entitled to. There is a difference." He tried to negotiate. He tried to suggest a smaller settlement, a more private arrangement, something that would keep the details of his second family out of the public record. Laura listened to all of it. Then she slid a single piece of paper across the table. It was a summary, prepared by Patricia, of exactly what Laura was entitled to under Connecticut law given the length of the marriage, her contributions to the household, her role as primary caregiver, and the documented financial deception over 6 years. Daniel looked at the paper for a long time. He looked up at her and said, "Laura, please." She said, "I think you should take that to your attorney." Then she stood up, refilled her coffee, and walked to her office. What nobody expected, not Daniel, not his attorneys, not even Patricia, was what Laura did in the days that followed. While the legal process was moving forward, Laura quietly reached out to 3 of Pinnacle Holdings' largest institutional investors. She did not share anything private or confidential. She simply introduced herself as a fellow professional looking to build new business relationships. She was warm, smart, and entirely composed. Within 2 weeks, she had opened 3 new doors that had nothing to do with Daniel or their marriage. She was not tearing his world down. She was simply building her own and making sure she was standing on solid ground before the walls of the old one came down completely. Mia found out on a Sunday. Laura had prepared carefully for that conversation. She sat with her daughter on Mia's bed with the door closed and no distractions. She told her, in the simplest and most honest words she could find, that her father and she would no longer be living together. She told her that both of her parents loved her completely and that none of this was her fault. Mia cried, and Laura held her and let her cry for as long as she needed. She did not say anything bad about Daniel. She did not explain the full story. She just held her daughter and let her feel what she needed to feel. When Mia finally pulled back and wiped her face and asked, "Are you sad, Mom?" Laura looked at her and said, "Yes, but I'm also okay. And we are going to be okay too." Mia studied her face for a moment, the way children do when they are trying to decide whether to believe something. Then she nodded slowly and leaned her head against Laura's shoulder. And Laura held her and stared at the wall and kept the promise she had made to herself in the dark 11 days before. The divorce was finalized on a gray Thursday morning in October, 7 months after Laura had first sat in that coffee shop staring at photographs she had never wanted to see. She was wearing a dark green coat and low heels, and she signed her name in 3 places while sitting at a long table with Patricia on one side and a glass of water on the other. Daniel sat across the room with his own attorney. He looked tired. He had lost weight. He did not look at her directly, not even once. When it was done, Patricia squeezed her arm and said, "Well done." Laura picked up her bag and walked out of the building into the cold air. She stood on the pavement for a moment and breathed in slowly. Then she walked to her car and drove to Mia's school in time for pickup. The settlement had been exactly what Patricia had laid out in that single sheet of paper. The Connecticut house went to Laura to stay in it until Mia turned 18, at which point it would be sold and the proceeds divided. The Vermont vacation property was sold immediately, with Laura receiving 60% of the proceeds. She received a significant monthly support payment from Mia and a lump sum settlement that reflected the 6 years of financial deception. Daniel's attorneys had pushed back on everything. Patricia had pushed harder. In the end, the numbers had held firm. But money, Laura knew, was only one part of what had changed. The more important shift was happening inside her, quietly and steadily, the way a river changes course over time without making much noise about it. She was not the same woman who had stood in her driveway 7 months ago looking at a house full of warm light and wondering how everything she had believed in could look so normal on the outside while being so broken underneath. She had started waking up earlier, not out of anxiety, but because her mind was full of plans. She had ideas for her design business that she had pushed aside for years, telling herself she did not have the time or the bandwidth. Now she had both. She had been approached by a small home decor brand about a possible collaboration. She had said yes. She had been invited to speak at a local women in business event, something she would have politely declined before. She said yes to that too. She was saying yes to more things, and they were all her own things, chosen by her alone. Her friendship with Sarah deepened in ways she had not expected. Sarah, who had been hurt that Laura had kept the secret for so long, eventually understood. She came over one Friday night with a bottle of wine and 2 takeaway containers of food, and the 2 of them sat at Laura's kitchen table until almost midnight, talking the way they had not talked in years. Sarah said, at one point, that she did not know how Laura had held herself together the way she had. Laura thought about it for a moment and said, "I think I always knew that falling apart was an option. I just decided not to choose it." Sarah laughed and said, "You are genuinely terrifying." Laura smiled and poured more wine. Daniel moved into an apartment in the city. His relationship with Claire did not last, as it turned out. Frank Reyes, whom Laura had no reason to keep tabs through but heard about through a mutual acquaintance, had mentioned in passing that Claire and Daniel had separated shortly after the divorce proceedings became public. Laura received this information and felt nothing in particular about it. It was not her story anymore. What was harder and more ongoing was watching Mia navigate the new shape of her life. The little girl who had once been part of a complete Sunday morning family now had 2 separate homes, 2 separate routines, and a father she saw on scheduled weekends. There were hard moments. There was a period of 3 weeks in November where Mia refused to talk much at dinner and spent a lot of time in her room. Laura did not push. She kept showing up. She kept the routines steady. She signed Mia up for an art class that her daughter had been asking about for over a year. She drove her there every Saturday morning without fail. Slowly, Mia began to come back. Not to who she had been before. That child was gone, replaced by a slightly older and more serious version, but to someone new, who was figuring out how to carry more than she should have had to at 9 years old, and doing it with a quiet strength that made Laura incredibly proud. The business collaboration with the home decor brand launched in January, and it went better than Laura had allowed herself to hope. Her name was attached to a collection of accent pieces, cushions, throws, small framed prints, that were sold through the brand's online store and in 2 retail locations. It was not a huge deal by most standards, but it was hers. She had negotiated the contract herself with the help of a small business attorney. She had made the creative decisions. She had seen it through from first conversation to finished product, and when the first sales figures came in and they were solid, she sat at her desk and allowed herself a full minute of quiet satisfaction before moving on to the next task. She heard from Daniel occasionally. They communicated mostly through email about Mia's schedule and school matters. He was polite. She was polite. There were no scenes, no long emotional conversations, no attempts to revisit what had happened. Once, in February, he called her directly and said he wanted her to know that he was sorry. Not in a practiced way, but haltingly, like a man who had thought about it for a long time. Laura listened. She said, "I know." She meant it. Then she said she had to go pick Mia up, and she ended the call. She did not hate him. She had thought she might, but she did not. What she felt, when she allowed herself to feel anything about Daniel at all, was a quiet kind of sadness for the time that had been taken from her. Not by cruelty, she had eventually come to understand, but by a man who had been too afraid of honest consequences to ever tell the truth. That was its own kind of loss. But it was not her loss to carry anymore. Spring arrived in Connecticut the way it always did, sudden and green and full of noise. Laura had the back garden replanted, something she had talked about for years. Mia helped her choose the flowers. They spent a whole Saturday digging and planting together, both of them with dirt on their hands and their knees, laughing at nothing in particular, the afternoon light coming through the trees in long gold lines. Laura looked at her daughter crouching over a patch of soil with total concentration, small hands pressing a plant into the ground, and she felt something open up in her chest, not the sharp crack of 7 months ago, but something wide and warm and real. That evening, after Mia was asleep, Laura sat on the back step with a cup of tea and looked at the garden in the dark. She could smell the turned soil and the early flowers. The night was quiet. She thought about the woman she had been before the brown envelope, and the woman she was now, and the distance between the two. She did not feel sorry for that earlier version of herself. She had loved fully and trusted completely, and that was not a flaw. But she was grateful for who she had become on the other side of it. Quieter in some ways, harder in some ways, but more herself than she had been in a long time. She thought about something Mia had said to her a few weeks earlier, out of nowhere, while they were driving home from the art class. Mia had looked out the window and said, "Mom, I think you're braver than you think you are." Laura had laughed, surprised. She had said, "Where did that come from?" Mia had shrugged and said, "I don't know. I just think it." Laura had kept her eyes on the road and said nothing more. But she had held on to those words carefully, the way you hold on to something small and light that you are afraid the wind might take. She sat on the back step a little longer, finished her tea, and listened to the quiet. Then she went inside, locked the door, turned off the kitchen light, and walked upstairs to bed. Tomorrow was a school day. She had a client call in the morning and a deadline in the afternoon and Mia's art class pickup at 4. She had things to do and a life to get on with, and she was ready.